The buddies and I are back at it again with another Abandonware challenge since the last time was actually good for us. I got to try something I might not have otherwise with Area 51. This time I played through Shellshock PC, a third-person shooter by Guerrilla Games released in 2004. It wasn't too long of a game, so after finishing Shellshock, I had an urge to play through another Abandonware game set in the Vietnam War. This one I've been meaning to get around to for a long time due to the recommendation from an old friend. Vietcong, a first-person shooter developed by Pterodon and Illusion Softworks from 2003. While playing through Vietcong, I couldn't help but think of comparing certain aspects of it to Shellshock, and decided to make my project reflect that. Now, to be fair to these games, comparing the two is more on me than anything else because it's not like they actually competed directly against one another. There were plenty of Vietnam games released around this time, but the approaches to gameplay, structure, and tone differ so greatly that they almost counter each other. There are plenty of similarities between the two as well. Obviously, there are more surface level things like both taking place in 1967 with you playing as a member of the US Army Special Forces, but the paths of the two diverge immediately. While one game plays things as a straightforward tactical military shooter, the other aims to be a more loose interpretation of the setting. And in the end, one was a lot more successful in its execution. Before anything though, if you're playing these on consoles, you don't really have anything to worry about. But if you're playing the PC versions of these, there will be a bit of work to get both running properly. For Shellshock, it wasn't too hard. Aside from getting rid of the disc check, there were only two issues I encountered. The first was that any in-engine part of the game displayed as a black screen, whether it was a cutscene or gameplay. This can be solved by navigating through the Shellshock folder in your documents and finding the file named todpc.ini. Though the configuration file is sparse, add the line post-render effects and set it to off, and this will display the game. Additionally, the audio wasn't playing at all, which is fixed by downloading a newer version of OpenAL. I also had to delete the old OpenAL DLL from System32, which was a bit nerve-wracking as I've been mentally trained to never mess with anything in there, but after that the sound started to work. From there, the game ran smoothly with no crashes, a solid constant frame rate of 120 FPS, and while the resolution can be set to a custom size including widescreen, it will stretch out HUD elements. Instead, I opted for the 4x3 960p, and it was fine. Already, the differences begin before we can even start playing because the same cannot be said for Viet Cong. Getting it to boot was easy enough once I installed a custom launcher containing plenty of additional settings for modern compatibility, but the game must be updated to 1.6 in order to use this program. To get there, the game must be patched sequentially, which is something I haven't had to deal with ever, except for the on-disc versions of Dawn of War 1. Luckily, there aren't as many patches as that one had, so I think to get to 1.6 it either takes 2 or 3, but still. If you're running on Windows 10 like I am, an additional 1.7 beta DLL must be added to the base folder so that you won't have a choppy, slow frame rate. Finally, once you get everything to the way you like it, mess around with limiting some of the options. Things start to break if you go above 120 FPS, and throughout the game there are numerous chances for it to crash. I had a bunch happen consistently on the same trigger in a few areas, and I believe I solved this by setting textures in VRAM rather than system, though I also did have the prefer 16-bit textures checked sometimes as well. In any case, be prepared for the game to die on you, and even if booting everything back up takes almost no time at all, it does suck that crashing is a looming threat. Shellshock PC starts out by giving you the option to choose from one of 3 silent protagonists, but the difference is purely cosmetic. Only your rank insignia for your health changes aside from your player model. Once you've picked your guy, you're dropped straight into the first mission, which also serves as a tutorial level with your squad's lieutenant teaching you the basics of combat and movement. It's a simple provide support and attack an enemy base level, having you place C4 charges on a couple of anti-air guns and eliminating all enemy combatants. Pretty stock stuff. Once you're far enough in, the Special Forces team helicopters in and helps sweep up the rest of the base. The level is pretty short and linear, but for an introductory stage that's also teaching you game mechanics, it does its job well enough. What isn't fine is getting to that base, as the journey there exhibits Shellshock's #1 problem. Gunplay is off. It's not that it's bad, but it is underwhelming. It's not that simple to describe, but something definitely feels wrong in a few ways, so here's what I've noticed. For starters, the act of aiming is bad. The game says that there's no mouse acceleration, but I swear I feel it, as trying to quickly adjust aim at a minor angle can wildly swing your weapon off target. I found that this could be mitigated in closer ranges by using movement to compensate for these smaller adjustments, but at longer ranges you're just going to have to be careful. This unfortunately plays out against you with the other big issue with guns: bloom. It does vary based on the weapon you use, but unless you're fairly close to the target, shots will miss. That reticle gets big fast, and bullet spread leads to shots landing far outside it if you sustain fire for even the slightest bit too long. In some missions, that's not as big of a problem since you'll be fighting over shorter distances as you run up to the enemies, but for longer engagements, either grab a rifle on semi-automatic and go prone, or hit the sprint button and make it a close quarters fight yourself. I do have to admit some bias against the game here since this is a major problem with the M3 grease gun. You know, the gun that was designed to fire slower to give the shooter more control. The rest of the guns are serviceable enough, and when you do hit shots there is enough strength to drop enemies in a couple of hits. There is one gun that feels great to use, Carl Gustav M45 or Swedish K SMG. Since it's only 9mm, recoil and bloom are very manageable, leading to more shots landing, and it has an insane magazine capacity. Unfortunately, ammunition supplies are limited for that caliber, so most of the time the optimal route is to take an RPD off the ground and channel your run and gun nature. There will always be ammo for that thing. I feel like the bloom being as severe as it is really contributes to also confusing you on how the game wants you to play it, since the intended style of play is not the most effective. Make no mistake, this is an arcade shooter, and is best played as one, but there are instances in which the game claims otherwise. Characters say to make short, controlled bursts, stay in cover, and play things safe, aiming for a more realistic approach to combat. Alright, I get that, don't get too reckless. But Shellshock naturally has the pace of an arcade game due to enemy behavior, and it doesn't mesh well with playing strategically at all. While there always will be soldiers stationed in certain areas, there will be groups that continue to respawn just out of eyesight if you're not pressing the attack. The best comparison I can think of is like in Contra, if you're not moving forward, the game will spawn small guys that run at you. Okay, I can deal with that, but the rate at which these guys respawn is way too fast. In Mission 3, there was a series of caves I'd have to detour through in order to flank a heavy machine gun bunker. I take out the first group, prepare to advance into the tunnel when the second group is already on the way out. Once they're dispatched, the start of a third bunch is already on the inside waiting for me. I expect a few of these guys were supposed to be in here regardless of how fast I was, but I know that they're still spawning in here even when I'm inside. I sweep into one room, plant the C4, and exit, and there's already another dude that's just spawned. It's not just in tunnels either. Another big example I remember is when I got caught into a drawn-out firefight near the end with a Kar 98 and would pick off enemies one by one, but wasn't quick enough and more guys would refill their comrades' spots. You need to be constantly pressing the attack, and thankfully the most important system supports this playstyle, your health. It works like in Halo 1 with a base health level and a regenerating barrier. There are plenty of health kits scattered around to help bring you back to full, but the shooting mechanics and the game telling you that's not the correct way led to some confusion for me. It became frustrating when there are a couple of places that you do need to take caution or you will get mowed down, though the big ones are at least signaled to you ahead of time.
Forget it, man! We haven't a hope in hell, Redhorn! We're outnumbered 100 to 1!
Then it is an even fight.
Roger that, Redhorn. Oh, and I hope you burn in hell, sir.
If Shellshock fully committed to being an arcade shooter and ditched the misleading direction, I'd be complaining less. At the very least, tighten the spread and make the first shot go exactly where you're aiming. Vietcong, on the other hand, knows what it is, teaches you up front, and it expects you to stick to it. A tactical shooter with an emphasis on realism, or at least as real as an accessible FPS in 2003 should be. And to get full knowledge on how its systems work, you're given a boot camp set of tutorial levels that are optional but should be played. Through the constant vulgarity of your drill instructor, whose voice I can only describe as Cotton Hill trying his best early Ermy impression.
What the fuck was that, Private? Get into firing position! munitions, assholes! As soon as the target goes up, shoot it! Hawkins, don't fuck with me! Destroy those targets as you were ordered, or else I'll throw you at them!
You are taught the full range of motion by running an obstacle course, how to use guns with firing range training, how to use heavy ordnance on the big range, and finally how easily you can get killed through a paintball match. You can actually fail some of these, and doing so causes Cotton to go ballistic.
You fucked up, Hawkins! What the fuck happened? Don't bother to answer that. You're too stupid to stay covered in your hands. Hawkins, you fucking moron! What have I told you, you incompetent asshole? Come on, grease monkey!
Once you start the campaign, you arrive at your assigned base of Nue Pek and learn a couple of things immediately. For starters, you are playing as an actual character, Sergeant Steve Hawkins, and he is very much not a silent protagonist.
Take it easy, man. Don't forget that no battle plan survives the first contact with the enemy. I reckon we'll see plenty of action.
Nope. We'll sit through the greatest battle of the war in the fucking chopper. Shit.
Hornster?
Yeah?
Shut the fuck up. You're like a 5-year-old.
Within a few minutes, you'll go on to the first mission as part of an escort to deliver medical aid to a nearby Montagnard village. Before you can accept their gift of wine, a distant Viet Cong soldier takes aim on your squad, forcing you all into cover. The captain orders you to determine the sniper's location and advance under covering fire. Instead, I decided to see how well shooting enemies at range works in this game. I'm not expecting much with this M1 carbine, and in 4 shots I get him and win the mission. Viet Cong's gunplay is very, very satisfying. Each weapon has a purpose, yet will keep a base level of effectiveness. Shooting in short, controlled bursts comes naturally, as recoil is definitely a factor, yet bullet spread is much tighter, resulting in most of my shots going where I'm aiming. I'm not 100% down with the iron sights on this one, since a number of guns are slightly angled up. Rather than what I'm used to of actually aiming down sights and lining up the rear aperture with the front post, aiming is based off of where the top of that front post is. It's not the worst, but something to think about if I have to nitpick, and it does become a bit of a problem with the suppressed Model 39. Aside from that, boy does shooting feel great. Continuing as an example from Shellshock, the grease gun here is very much controllable and ammunition is far from scarce. Though if you prefer the Thompson's rate of fire, that is just as fine as an alternative, and of course it shares the same ammo. Plenty of guns are fun to use, but the M16 takes the gold as the best in the game. It has good power and highly manageable recoil, but its magazine capacity is only at 18 rounds for some reason, rather than the standard 20. The only arcade nature of gunfights in Viet Cong is if the enemy is distracted long enough for you to penetrate their lines and start wiping them out. You can still play aggressively at times, but for the most part you will have to take cover, you will have to pick them off one by one, and most importantly you will actually have to stop and know where they are. If they see you and have a shot, they will take it. Death is much more of a threat than in Shellshock, as you can get dropped very quickly if you're not careful. That said, the checkpoint system is fair enough, and you are given the ability to quick save, but Viet Cong says you don't get to be a save scum and casual about it. Health works as a standard health bar. When you get hit, you get hurt, and you stay hurt. Using medkits and quickly getting healed by a medic will bring you back up, but you do have a persistent loss of health that, as you take more damage and heal again, results with less of a health bar to work with. This resets at the end of an operation, but does stay across levels, so while there will be plenty of medkits to use in missions, there's only so many times you can heal before that bar gets a little too short. Will you take damage? Absolutely. Enemy behavior in this one is a lot more aggressive, as they will seek you out if they even think somebody is in the area. Running through the jungle is dangerous, and if you're not keeping an eye out for soldiers, you're going to run right into them and get killed. For the most part, navigating should be done by the pointman, who will take the lead and give you at least a rough idea on where enemies are if you stray close enough to any, as well as take you in the direction of the current objective. When you do run into other groups, the shooting starts and all hell breaks loose. Going back to Shellshock real fast, while you do work with a squad, you'll be more focused on your own path and gunning mostly as a solo act, no real teamwork. That is not the case with Viet Cong. You live and die by the squad. Each soldier has a role, with you being the leader, giving orders through menu commands that can alter the tactics used. And even if you break ranks and attempt something on your own, your team will keep the enemy's attention. At the very least, it does feel like they pull their weight, though often at the debriefing it's revealed that you're still carrying everybody hard. If nothing else though, the idea of being only one in a specialized group does get conveyed. When nearby or after firefights, the medic will always heal anybody who has been hit or even incapacitated, including yourself. The engineer will always have ammo to spare should you run low, provided it's a caliber he has. The radio man will allow you to relay messages back to HQ in order to determine the next course of action as objectives are completed or altered, as well as call in artillery strikes. The machine gunner lays down suppressive fire. You are a part of a unit, and working together you will live to fight the next day. This works great with the emphasis on realism, and honestly I had a blast with the team dynamic. There are a couple of levels thrown in which you are separated from your squad, and the absence of friendlies covering for you drives home the vulnerability of lone wolfing it. All that said, I played through both games on medium settings and they weren't too difficult. Vietcong definitely took a lot longer since it's a slower paced game, as well as overall having a longer campaign, but both titles' difficulty was set about right and missions didn't overstay their welcome if they didn't intend to. They both share a similar level structure in that you can return to base in between operations for a little downtime, and also resupply before heading out onto the next one. Shellshock gets this right by giving you the entire base to explore. You can talk to soldiers and other NPCs, listen to licensed songs provided by DJ Zap Brannigan.
Sure, no problem. All you gotta do is sign up for another 6 months tour. Easy, as they say.
Swap out equipment, buy contraband from that dude you know, and fuck. The base actually helps develop the characters' personalities, sharing their thoughts on what's going on. If the previous mission went well, people will be in good spirits. If someone screwed up, they'll all be gossiping about them.
Great, man, real great. I'm just trying to stay alive, and that asshole lieutenant calls in bombs on us. His own men!
Another one of the reasons to take your time at base is to fully load your arms as well as choose which one you want to take for the next mission. Sergeant Platts, the armorer, will also give you a bunch of advice and trivia on your selected gun if you talk to him. Walking to the other side of the base brings you to Deuce, who runs the shop. Other items such as drugs that increase stamina and decrease weapon sway, as well as pinups and the R&R pass can be purchased here. He also sells the forbidden 10mm. These can be bought with chits, farmed from manually looting bodies of patches and other northern Vietnamese memorabilia. If you're stopping to search every body you find, you'll have enough money for what you want. Finally, there's Mama-san, who hosts a number of women on the outskirts of base for sex. I'm not sure if there are any advantages gained by having sex, but it felt like when I did, the next mission my actions were slightly faster and I could sprint for slightly longer. If there are benefits, it is subtle. Overall, I really enjoy this base feature, since it helps to provide a nice, safe area to take a breather. Base will always be safe. Vietcong's opening allows you to explore a much more realistic base map and hence the ability to listen in on conversations between members of your squad and the allied CIDG, but this is only for the opening. In between missions, you can check out your room, which offers the next mission's briefing and previous mission's stats, as well as some information sheets to detail groups, events, and weapons. The radio inside provides the licensed music here, and aside from doing some reading, it's just a cozy personalized area to sit around in. The only other place you can go is the firing range, where you can choose a weapon for the next stage or get some practice in with it. I was disappointed with this because I wanted to go exploring the base. They didn't just make that whole level for one tiny part of the introduction, right? Surely walking around camp was an intended feature that probably got cut for time or resources, which sucks, but I can understand when the rest of the game has the content that it does. As it turns out, there are instances which you do get to run around, but they are far from winding down segments.
In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if try another assault. Damn it, fuck, they're inside the wire.
A couple of times during the game, Noi Pek gets hit by Viet Cong attacks, in which you'll have to fight back on your own turf and push them out. I was legitimately shocked the first time it happened, and thankfully the game does not overuse this as filler, so when the signal flares start launching, it's time to hold down the fort. I feel like this would hit harder if I was more familiar with the base layout rather than from just the first time, but these are still fun segments. Most of the missions take place out in the lush jungles and valleys of Vietnam, and each game paints a very different image of the country. Shellshock's levels are more varied in actual architecture, as you'll be fighting through wooded areas, cities, smaller villages, and even a couple of fortresses. I enjoyed the urban fights especially as a good change of pace, as enemies attack from all angles and elevations as you work your way through the streets. The Backpack M60 helps to alleviate the stress here. The levels are fairly linear, which works for that kind of game, and as the campaign goes on, the challenge gets more intense, mostly playing into the game's arcade nature. For the most part, mission variety isn't too bad either. There are a number of simple supply line destructions and search and rescue operations, usually isolated to their particular stage. An exception to this is missions 3 and 4, involving an assault on a fortress followed by holding it onto the next stage. All of the missions are pretty straightforward at first, but a couple of levels decide to swerve off course after you reach your objective. The second stage has you investigate a small village suspected of being sympathetic to the Viet Cong, and possibly hiding weapons for them. Once you arrive, the lieutenant orders you to round up all of the villagers and search the area, and you do end up finding a couple of stashes of AKs as well as an RPG cache. One of the villagers makes a run for it, and you're ordered to stop him. Understandably, the rest of the villagers are pissed and, well, the true nature of Shellshock's tone is revealed. In war, morality flies out the window in an instant. Shellshock hammers this in with bodies being strung up and mutilated as warnings, as well as depictions of torture and numerous war crimes being committed on both sides of the conflict. Unfortunately, this can get obscured by the game itself. This is the period which ragdoll physics were brand new, and the developers wanted to show off the tech, so mowing down dozens can result in bodies jumping around. To be fair to the game, they don't normally go flying, but they can also fall over too exaggerated. Shooting off limbs and heads would have probably worked in the favor of this game's desired tone in 2004, but I can't take it seriously after being exposed to newer games that do a much better job. And I swear they really do just pop in this one. There are a couple of instances in which the game does get uncomfortable, but for the most part it falls more into territory similar to that of a laughably bad exploitation film because it's trying too hard. Viet Cong's levels are still linear, and most of them will be traversing the terrain, taking part in small engagements throughout the hike. There's less variance in that most of your fighting will be done in the wilderness, with only a couple of times of coming across a village every now and then. Despite this, the missions themselves are much more varied from one another and can flip objectives on a dime. Intel says northern Vietnamese forces are deploying tanks. Go check it out. Oh, no, they were old French tanks. Whoops. Now one of the allied squads got hit, and you have to go rescue any survivors. We found where he's being held, so sneak through this swamp at night and infiltrate the camp to retrieve him. It's an exciting set of events that doesn't let up even if the shooting stops for a while, since the threat of being hit is always present. One of the most memorable levels is a simple mission of taking the next shift on defending a small outpost. As you fly in and perform a few strafing runs, the storm picks up and you have to take over on top of the hill, watching as Viet Cong forces begin to attack. At first it's only a few waves of enemies, but as the mission goes on you absolutely get swarmed and overwhelmed. Eventually you do get cycled out as the outpost is lost, but it is a long, exhausting night. Your squad made it through together though, and if you keep working together, you'll make it through the next one too. And that is Viet Cong's goal. Its tone is closer to that of a standard war film, and due to the longevity of battles, war becomes hell. Stress builds up, and aside from base interludes, there is no downtime to take a breather. But perseverance through that will see success in ways that you earn, not given to you. It is a very satisfying game because of how much work you have to put into it, but it all pays off in the end as a result of you being good at playing. In regards to graphics, both games are products of their time, but each specializes in an area that the other lacks. Everything in Shellshock that's a pre-rendered cutscene is just dirty for the sake of being dirty. Animations are jerky, it's compressed to hell and back, and overall conveys its intended grit, but it's way too overwhelming. In contrast, the in-engine stuff isn't too bad at all. The animations are all buttery smooth, and this extends to in-engine cutscenes where people's movement feels much more natural. The draw distance is good enough, but models load their low-poly substitutes way too closely. It becomes pretty distracting when you're standing about 10 feet away from somebody and can move back and forth to change the level of detail. This might be a blessing for when NPCs are talking, as the closer models just open and shut their mouths continuously, not matching what's actually being said.
You ready to go? Just move on out the gate, soldier.
Come on, Half-Life 1 had this down 6 years before this game.
I don't suppose you'd reconsider?
Almost all of the textures are very low detailed, but the constant film grain oddly enough works to help out, and normally I can't stand any sort of post-processing filter like that. One small detail I do like, the tree splintering. Oftentimes video games depict stumps as either slightly deformed or flattened when hit by fire, but Shellshock holds one aspect of realism here. Trees explode, and the leftovers look pretty good. Overall, the game's maps aren't terribly designed at all and have plenty of detail, but while each area is representative of its location, they feel like video game levels set in Vietnam. If you want immersion, this looks and feels and most importantly plays like actual environments you could go find. The jungles are overwhelmed with plant life and able to be walked all over rather than just being limited to a set path, offering plenty of options for cover and flanking. You're given a map to navigate each level, and if you're not good at map reading yet, you will be. Time to learn about elevation and landmarks and how to estimate distances if you want to call in fire support properly. The valley's scale is great, showing how expansive some of the areas can get, and flying around in helicopters only helps to sell the scene. Conversely, tunnels are cramped and claustrophobic, and the further you dive in, the more lost you get. All of this continues to add to Vietcong's sense of realism. What you see is what you get, and it loves showing it to you, good and bad. While environments and textures have a lot more detail to them, characters look ugly and lifeless. In-game animations are alright, but during cutscenes, oftentimes they'll just sit completely still, staring ahead if they're not the ones talking. It's a bit jarring compared to how much effort was put into the rest of the game, but considering that environments are the important part here and not how people act in cutscenes, at least the priorities were correct with limited resources. I have two big personal complaints that actively drain the experience from each game. Shellshock prides itself on shock imagery, but the biggest war crime it commits is what it does to the flamethrower. Now, we didn't get flamethrowers correct for a long time in video games, but we usually have gotten the ignite my target part right. When I use incendiary weapons, I want burning and satisfying kills, not this mild inconvenience. This is impotence on your part, Guerrilla Games, how dare you. Viet Cong's worst fault is your squad's pathfinding. Good God, is it awful. In open areas, the worst you'll see is squad mates run back and forth humorously, sometimes repeatedly vaulting over waist-high obstacles like down trees. When asked to lead, the pointman can double back a few meters before finding his path again. Out in the open, this isn't too bad, but always be careful of how your squad takes a trench or confined space. They will block you in, and you cannot push them. The most you can hope for is calling the specific soldier over to your current position through the number pad commands and hope they move out of the way, but this isn't a guaranteed way to fix it. Two final pieces I want to compare are how each game handles traps and stealth. Traps in Shellshock are blatantly pointed out by signs on the ground, and even without those are very easy to spot. The spring traps are fatal and only defeated by crawling underneath them as they swing out, but you can survive the grenades. To defuse them, there's a short minigame of following the line with the arrow keys, which the directions aren't the most intuitive to look at, but it comes natural enough with a few tries. There is a timer that begins once the first defusing attempt is made, and you can retry before the grenade explodes, but like I said, it's only going to do a lot of damage to your barrier and minor health damage provided both are full. Viet Cong's traps are much harder to spot and are all instantly fatal. The only way to know where they are is either by eyeing them yourself or having the pointman spot them out when he's in the lead. There's no minigame to disarm the grenades, but you will have to get very close, so if you see one and have a quick save available, it wouldn't be the worst idea to use it. Also be careful of where you walk, as punji pits can be found in a couple of the levels. Continuing to stay mindful of your surroundings helps, and balancing between looking out for enemies and traps will keep the tension high. Concerning stealth, in Shellshock it does not work. It's possible that on consoles the analog stick sensitivity is low enough to sneak up on enemies, but on PC the only time I was able to properly get behind someone without them noticing was crawling with the walk modifier. Everything else immediately draws their attention and they know exactly where you are based on sound if they've heard you. There does appear to be a limit to this hearing though. The knife is supposed to be a one-hit kill, and it does work when slitting throats, but again, getting behind someone is next to impossible. Luckily, stealth is optional, making the M79 your best friend. Meanwhile, stealth is inherent to Viet Cong's gameplay, assuming you can get the drop on enemies. There will be times where it may be better to hold off on ambushing a passing patrol. Since sound isn't broken and you can crouch walk up to guards, the quieter you are, the better off you'll be. The best stealth segment in the game is when you have to find your way to a pickup point, and after running around the tunnels you find yourself in a small village. This stage is so much fun because getting spotted isn't a game over, but it might as well be. Enemies will see you out in the open, but taking your time to sneak properly will get you past the guards. Also, I learned that setting off a grenade in one of the huts completely incinerated it, and the guards that had wandered inside. The knife in this game works as a good melee weapon and is silent, but the only time I ever used it was when I ran out of ammo in my pistol.
I don't need no guns! I'm gonna kill you now!
After all is said and done, it's pretty obvious that I favored Viet Cong over Shellshock. There is a lot more personality to it, even if it is a little rough around the edges, and at its core it's a fun and satisfying first-person shooter. That's not to say I hated my time with Shellshock, but I was pretty disappointed with it. I can easily recommend Viet Cong to anyone looking for a fun tactical shooter, even if it's not the newest or most stable of games. As for Shellshock Nom 67, I can't recommend it, but it is a very short game, so if you do want to give it a shot, it won't take you more than a few hours. Both games do have sequels that apparently don't do as well as the first games, but those are going to have to get in line. Maybe at some point long down the road. In the meantime, thank you for watching. A quick reminder, this was part of a collaboration between a bunch of us, and this time we had more participants. I've linked their channels in the description and their videos, so go check them out. I can personally vouch for each one of them being cool dudes.